Hello, welcome to the Professor Network. Today we have with us Dr. Igor Grossmann, who is a social cognitive psychologist and an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Grossmann, you do literally the coolest stuff with wisdom and judgment and cultural change, and I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so now you run the Wisdom and Cultural Lab at UW. Could you quickly tell me about your area of expertise and the kind of research that your lab tends to focus on?
Well, I would say I'm not really an expert in anything because I'm just doubling into a lot of different topics. But essentially what we are doing, we are trying to track or develop methods to track how societies change and evolve over time and have evolved over the last few hundred years. And at the same time, my lab also focuses on how people reason and how they deal with difficult situations or complex situations where there is no clear right or wrong answer. What can you do in those type of situations? Philosophers for a long time talked about it as a domain of wisdom. So I guess I'm studying wisdom.
So what specifically got you interested in the research of wisdom?
Well, I've always been interested in the question of how people think and how people make sense of the world around them. And this type of making sense of the world around you can be in the context of, how do you make sense how to ride a bicycle? And I was not very interested in that. Or how do you make sense of how to solve a logical problem? More interesting, but not so interesting. But how do you make sense of societal changes or when people have completely polarized opinions about the topic? See, I grew up during the time of the fall of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. And then I moved to another country. And as many immigrants who come from a different cultural background, I didn't really understand why people think differently than I was. And so for me, this type of interest in wisdom came from this interest in really trying to understand how people make sense of the world around them, including people who are different from you.
Now, I know that along with your postdoc student, Amanda Rotala, and a few other profs from across North America, you've organized the Forecasting Collaborative, where you ask scientists from across the world to help make forecasts about key issues such as gender bias based on these massive public data sets. Could you talk to me about the science of forecasting and what it's been like trying to organize such a venture?
Sure. So my lab has always been interested in societal change. That's one of the key topics that we're studying. But I'm also interested in the domain of wisdom. And one key aspect of wisdom is to be able to make accurate predictions, if you want, about the future. And at some point, I decided to combine the two and study them in the context of COVID-19 and use this as the COVID as an opportunity for us as scientists to evaluate our own ability to make predictions about the future. And so the idea is really try to assess how good different scientific approaches to making predictions are. And compare the predictions versus the actually available data later on. And so what we did, we identified a set of domains for which public data was available on a monthly basis, which is really harder than you may think, because quite often we don't really get this kind of massive scale data on a national level collected every month. But we were able to identify some, including implicit and explicit gender bias, including racial bias, and including things like life satisfaction and political polarization. And so what we did, we asked people just to make forecasts for the next 12 months. We did that in May of this year. And we had over 80 teams from all the way around the world who participated. Some of them are data scientists, some of them are economists, some of them are social psychologists, and they use very different approaches. And so what we can do now is we can try to identify which approaches are potentially more accurate than others. And also, do scientists systematically differ if they just use big data, data-driven approaches, or even some simple statistical approaches, or if they use a theory-based approaches, or a combination of the two? I call it the hybrid between the sort of like theoretically guided and data-oriented. And so right now we can evaluate sort of like the general trajectories, and there is a bit of a difference between these approaches, but we still need to wait until the May of next year when we actually get the accuracy data, when the events actually happen, and then we can compare the forecasts versus the actual data.
That sounds honestly incredible and like such a huge task, and I'm honestly so excited to see the results. Now, I know that it's too early to compile different experts' findings and everything right now, but just based on what you've seen so far and based on what you know so far, what would you say would be your idea of a prediction of what's going to happen after COVID?
Well, which domain are you talking about? Because obviously there are different domains, and different things can happen for different domains.
I will take implicit racial bias.
I don't think there'll be much change in implicit racial bias. Generally, implicit stuff is hard to change, especially in a short time period. It seems to fluctuate quite a bit from month to month. If you look at the data so far, a lot of fluctuations. So, I mean, I would love to see change in implicit racial bias. By the way, fun fact about implicit racial bias, or racial bias in general, when we thought of collecting this data, when we looked around what kind of data sets can we estimate on a monthly basis and ask people to make predictions about, the one that we were originally least interested about was the racial bias, because it was like, well, surely COVID-19 will not have big impact on how racially biased people will be and how much conflict that would be causing the COVID crisis. Now, that was at the beginning of May. Little did we know that in the beginning of June, the whole situation changed dramatically, and we were, thank God we collected that data. Thank God we asked people to make those forecasts, because of course we had this very traumatic experiences and riots all the way around the States, but also in Canada and other parts of the world, where we've seen what may be COVID, maybe it's completely unrelated. We don't know entirely yet, but there was quite a bit, of course, of the reaction.
That's amazing, and so lucky that you collected it right when you did.
Yeah.
So what's something that you have noticed a change in?
We've seen a lot of changes in mental health, and I would dare to say we'll probably see a number of negative trajectories further in the fall and in the winter terms, when more people will be laid off, when more people will have to spend a lot of time inside. So that will be very, very challenging. And I'm not even sure we are really prepared to deal with that, but that we'll see. At the same time, I think we also have seen a number of positive aspects where people do really try to get together and remind each other that we are all in this together, and it's not like that everybody for him or herself, at least on the country level here in Canada. Of course, we have seen a lot of geopolitical confrontations, which will probably continue, especially around the time when the vaccines hopefully will hit the market, because it seems like from the current narrative and the discussions, it will be quite a bit of a political battle there. Who will get them first, in what capacity, and who will get the treatment first. So this sounds all negative, but I think not all of it is bad, and the situation is unfolding. It's hard to make predictions about things that, to some extent, really depend on what forecasting experts call contingencies or conditional variables. And in this case, for instance, here in North America, Even though we are in Canada, of course, we are closely related to the United States. And this conditional variables include the election, the presidential election that will happen in November, as well as when the vaccine will become available.
This is so interesting. It's so cool to know that your forecasting depends on so many variables. Like, it sounds like it's so hard to do, and it makes sense that all the predictions made by different people would be completely different from each other, just because different people might be taking into consideration different variables. So this
you would think, but it's not really the case. So for instance, we did large scale surveys of both academics and lay people about their intuitions. We did that both in April at the peak of the first wave of the pandemic in North America, as well as in early May, a month later, when that peak sort of resided a little bit. And what we found is, first of all, there was not much of a difference if you are, at least in terms of the intuitions, for a wide range of domains. The predictions of academics and of lay people were very similar, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because it suggests that psychologists and other social scientists are probably not well trained in making forecasts in the first place. And at the same time, we found a bit of a difference in terms of the confidence. So even though the forecasts were very similar, both among academics and the lay people, and pretty homogeneous, I have to emphasize. What that means is that actually the majority of the people were having very similar intuition about how for instance, the birth rates will unfold, life satisfaction, depression, and other mental health disorders, as well as civic unrests and so general generosity in the society. So those intuitions in terms of where they will be at different time of the year, at 2 years, were similar. But the confidence that academics showed as compared to lay people was very different. So academics were much less confident in their forecasts than lay people. So there's at least that. At least maybe having a degree in psychology makes you a little bit more careful in making predictions, which are so inherently hard to make because, as I pointed out earlier, it really depends on additional factors that may or may not happen.
I think what you just talked about is the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like, people who are more experienced in something will have less confidence in their knowledge.
Yeah, to some extent. My friend Dave Dunning, he always makes this joke that the people believing that they understand the Dunning-Kruger effect is a good example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So in this context, it is related to Dunning-Kruger effect, but actually the Dunning-Kruger effect refers to something different.
Well, I am so glad that just got caught on tape. I am not embarrassed at all. This is fantastic.
Hey, I make mistakes all the time, and this is not even a mistake. It's really of a joke. If you ask somebody about the Dunning-Kruger effect because they read it in the newspaper, they will feel like they really know what it's about. And of course, you really need to read the papers, the scientific papers, to understand what it's about. And it's a beautiful demonstration of the effect at its all levels. So really meta, but oh well.
I love that this happened. So happy to share this interview with everyone. But anyways, thank you so much for talking to me about all of this. This was endlessly interesting and so fascinating. And I honestly cannot wait to see whether your predictions and everyone else's predictions actually come true.
Yeah, me neither. Hopefully, we will be able to get to that phase where we can actually assess the data in a year's time. It's really hard to even imagine what the world will look like by the summer of next year.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for talking to me. I am so grateful to have had this chance.
Thank you for having me.